Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Conscious Grief Series 5. Today, I am joined by Teresa Whalen, who is an animal communicator and a grief counselor. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tara. Very happy to be here.
I'm so happy you're here, so thank you. And it's fascinating work that you do. I always love to have speakers on these series who talk about pet grief and animal loss. And it's so fascinating to me that, I have to say, one of the favorite parts is talking to people like yourself and mediums, because I just find it so incredible that people can communicate with animals and spirit, and how helpful this can be in our grieving process. So perhaps to begin with, you can share with us, how you became an animal communicator and a grief counselor.
Okay. Well, the grief counseling actually started first before the counseling, even though my graduate work and degrees are in psychotherapy. There was a draw, of course, to that, but I never thought I would specialize in grief until I lost my first cat as an adult. And I loved him like a soulmate, like a child. We were very, very close. And his death was premature. He was very young. And it just rocked me. It just rocked me. And as any counselor or therapist can tell you, it's one thing when you help everybody else, but when it's your loss, it just threw me. And this was in the 80s. And at that time, there wasn't any literature. There was no literature on pet loss. And there weren't any support groups. It was just, there you are by yourself. And I naively thought, well, I know how I'm supposed to deal with my feelings, but I'll be okay. I wasn't. So I really scoured the grief literature that wasn't about animal loss, just to give myself some support and paradigms. And that was helpful. And then my vet at the time, who I was very friendly with, who had just was a wonderful, wonderful guy. And he watched me and sort of held my hand through that year of this deep grief, because I'd see him with my other cats. And at one point he said, Teresa, I've watched you go through this. I know you have a counseling background. Would you help my clients? Because he said, I love my clients. I try to be compassionate with them, which he definitely was. But he said, I don't know how to do what you do. So that started it. I started doing support groups in his little tiny front foyer. And then I started doing some workshops, some psychoeducational workshops to help people through it. So that's how that started for me. And I did that part-time for a handful of years, but I was still doing some other work. And then the animal communication is a very different story. And if you ask any animal communication consultant how they started, you'll hear an array of how that began for them. For me, I could always hear the animals. Sometimes a little girl, my cat, would talk with me. I had a very difficult childhood, and she was my rock. She would talk to me and tell me, you're going to be okay. You're going to get out of here someday and grow up, blah, blah, blah. So we were very, very close. But as a little kid, that was just natural. I didn't think about it. I just talked to them. And once in a while, I'd say something to my parents. Oh, the cat's saying this or she's saying this. And I was very little, so I wasn't processing, do they believe me or not? I was just saying what was happening. And I realized, and they were humoring me. They thought I was making things up as a little kid. Until one day, we were at a park. I can still picture this. It was so sad. It was one of those parks where lots of ducks come up to the edge of the pond and people feed them white bread, which of course is the worst thing you can feed wild ducks. But we didn't know that then. And this dozens of ducks, this one came right up to where I was standing and was going like this with his little beak, and he couldn't quack. And he was telling me, because that happens sometimes when animals can kind of sense who's going to hear them, and he came right up to me. And he was just in tremendous pain and trauma and said, something's wrong with me. My throat hurts. Can you help me? Can you help me? Well, I was like maybe 5 or 6 years old at the most, probably more like 5. And I didn't know how to deal with that the way I do today when I'm in the presence of someone in great pain. I didn't know how to keep my upset to the side while I helped this other being. I just started crying hysterically. and screaming to my parents, we have to take the little duck to the vet. We have to get this duck to the vet. And they're saying, why? And I said, he's telling me blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't stop crying because I was feeling the pain of that duck because I didn't know how to protect myself energetically at the time. I just took in everything an animal was feeling. And my parents, who were not happy people, were not, let's say, skilled parents, got very angry with me for making a scene. And I couldn't stop crying. I was screaming and begging them to take the duck to the vet. And then they started slapping me around and told me to be quiet and dragged me in the car and we went home. And inside, I know I made a decision that hour. I will never, ever tell anybody again that I can hear animals because I was punished for it. So I never did. I still would hear them and talk with them, and I enjoyed that, but it was this secret. And of course, then I became a teenager, young adult. I didn't want to be weird, so I never told anybody until 1988, and I saw my first whale. And that's a whole story in itself, which is a lovely story, but not for today. Anyway, this whale, long story short, I built this relationship with that day. He came to the side of the boat. He stayed for an hour. We had this long conversation that was very personal, very meaningful, very life-changing for me, which people who meet with whales tend to have those kinds of things happen. And I remember driving home that day. We were driving from Cape Cod. This was off Provincetown. If anybody listening knows Massachusetts, the Cape Cod's on the tip of the Cape. And I was driving home to Philadelphia with this friend who was an engineer, and I'm telling her this whole thing, and she's looking at me like, you have lost your mind. But what happened to me because of the whale is I didn't care what anybody thought anymore. It was like, there's no purpose to keeping this a secret. It's very important because I was thinking other people could speak with animals and exchange this kind of support and gain wisdom. So anyway, that was the turning point for me. And within about 18 months, I moved to California from the East Coast, and I met Dr. Jerry Ryan, who passed away about 2 years ago. But she became my very good friend, my mentor. I studied animal communication with her. The reason I trusted her is she was also a therapist. And because I was this corporate person, I worked in human resources, and the thought of becoming an animal communicator professionally was the last thing in the world I could see myself doing. But then I met Jerry, and here she is, this PhD psychologist, and she's very normal and she's very grounded. And she said, study, you do this naturally, take some of my classes. So I sponsored a lot of her classes, took them, and she pushed me into doing it professionally, I don't know, about a year later. So that's how that all came to be. And since that time, I've had what we call in clinical work a dual practice. So I see clients privately in addition to teaching and workshops. Some people come to me just to help me get help speaking to their animals. Some people come just for grief counseling when they're grieving the loss of an animal, and some come for both. So anyway, that's how I got into it and what I do. And I'm very honored to do it. It's something that I hope I live at least 20 more years so I can keep doing it. So anyway.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's fascinating stories and really, truly fascinating. And, a lot of people, one of my best friends, her dog passed away literally a week and a half ago. And, it's her child. And a lot of people won't respond to her grief probably in the same way as if it was a human child.
Exactly.
And I just wondered, whether you could talk us through, the differences really of how animal loss is different.
Well, thank you for asking that. And that's actually one of the chapters in my audiobook is just how and why animal loss is different. And that is not to say that other losses can't be traumatic and overwhelming, whatever. Of course they are. But I think the main thing to talk about, which is a sharing trait, if you will, to some other losses people have, and that is that it's still pet loss in most cultures is still a disenfranchised loss. And what disenfranchised basically means, and Ken Doka in the grief field came up with that application of that term for certain losses. It means when the society you're in does not recognize even the relationship you're in with the one who died as legitimate. And therefore, the loss is not seen as legitimate. And of course, what that turns into then is people don't support you the way they would if you had a non-disenfranchised loss. And, there are examples beyond pet loss, like in the early years of the AIDS epidemic, people who lost a partner to AIDS were not supported. People with AIDS weren't supported, but certainly when there was death and loss, it just was sort of, poo-poo. People were not supported. And there are other ones, like what so many women know, and I went through this years ago, miscarriage. People talk about miscarriage. They'll say things like, well, have another one. Try again. This one lost a baby, not tissue. And so, I might have some other examples I broke down here, but also another one is when somebody is not married to their partner, their soulmate, and that person dies, which used to happen a lot, of course, in gay and lesbian relationships. Thankfully, that's changed a bit in many places. Everybody can get married, but that's still not true everywhere. And when it wasn't, it was just awful, the things that would happen to people. So those are just some examples of disenfranchised losses that offer very little public support, and then that trickles down to very little individual support. I mean, for instance, when my father died many years ago, I went to support my mother, of course. And in her religion's tradition, you have this thing called a viewing before the burial, and people come to pay their respects, and then the family stands in a line, and everybody comes and says something. Trust me, nobody said to my mother, "Oh, Emily, I'm so sorry Fred died. Just go get another husband. It'll make you feel better." Nobody would say that about the loss of a husband, but they say it all the time about animals. "Oh, go get another golden retriever. Just go to the pound to get another one as soon as you can." So that's just one example, but it's clearly a different kind of loss. And the thing I think is so important for everyone to know who doesn't have animals is that the most important part of any relationship is not the form or the species, it's the love. And when that's recognized versus being disenfranchised and seen as unimportant, then people get the support that they need. Because it's not the species, it's not the form that matters, it's the love. And anyway, there are a couple other things about disenfranchised losses that have to do with animals. One is animals tend to love us unconditionally. Not that some humans can't, but it's a different kind of relationship. And it's easier, I have to say this, it's much easier for an animal to give unconditional love and for us to love them unconditionally than a human, because we have different boundaries with our humans, different issues that don't come up with animals. So I don't want to say animals are perfect and humans are horrible, not at all, but it's a different kind of relationship. And so if there's one thing I've heard from 99.99% of my clients is that my animal loved me unconditionally. And many do say more than my spouse or my mother or whatever. Not that I don't love those people, but it's a more complex relationship. So the unconditional love is very big. And when that goes, when the animal dies, it's horrible. And one of the things I'll talk about when we start talking about legacies is when that cat died, that first loss I had as an adult, his love to me was the first absolute unconditional love I had in my adult life. And when he died, there was this huge, horrible void. So we'll talk about that later, but that is a big factor, is that unconditional love. And another one is, which we've already touched on, is that the death of animals in many cultures is still trivialized. Like it's not important. It's just trivialized. It's just not as significant. Like your friend, who people probably would be treating her very differently had her loss been a human child versus an animal child. So that the trivialization is big. Then there's a third one, and that's this prejudice that exists in a lot of places, certainly in the North American culture that I live in, that we shouldn't love animals as much as people. And that when we do, something might be wrong with us. And I remember years ago sitting in some doctor's office, and there was this parenting magazine. I was just reading it because there was nothing else to read. And there was this article on pet loss. I thought, well, this is great. And it was this article about, how to help your child through pet loss. So this is great. And I'm reading it. And after a while, I got so angry, I wanted to rip it up. And I thought, no, I'm keeping this as a teaching tool. I actually stuffed it in my tote bag, I think. But I was furious because the person who wrote it said, yes, do this, this, and this for your child. And all of it was good, except at the end, she said, because after all, it's practice for the real thing. Quote, unquote. You're helping your child practice for real losses, like when they might experience their grandparents dying or somebody else, like for the real thing, like an animal dying is not the real thing. So there's that ugly prejudice. And of course, the biggie that makes it such a different loss is that with animals, much more so than people, which is still rare, we have the choice of euthanasia. When our animal is suffering physically to the point that their quality of life is just awful, we have that choice. And it's for myself and virtually every client I've worked with about it, people talk about how it's sometimes the hardest decision they're faced with in their life. And we could talk for an hour just on the whole euthanasia issue, but I have a class that's 2 hours long just on euthanasia. But that issue of being in the place to make the choice, and as in my mind, there's positive and negative to that, because thank God, in my opinion, we do have the option. Because when our animals are really suffering, we, unlike with most human situations near end of life, where they just suffer till they die with some medication, whatever, we have the option to help our animals leave. And not everybody may, of course, choose that option, and that's a whole other topic. But because the option is even there, it makes it a whole different kind of loss. And I will say one more thing I'll say about euthanasia is that I would say 75 to 80% of my clients, when they talk with me after an animal death that involved euthanasia, will say to me, I'm so terrified that I made the choice too soon and robbed my beloved animal of another day or another week. Or they'll say, I feel so guilty because I know I waited too long. They were suffering, but I couldn't bear to say goodbye. So those are very natural, common things we go through with our animals. And so because it's not yet anyway, and maybe never will be, a common part of our choices with human loved ones or for ourselves when we're ill and facing death, it makes something that makes animal loss different, very different. And because it is a disenfranchised loss and those factors make it so different, one of the things that translates into as something practical is we need to be very careful and thoughtful about the support that we seek. And that's one of the very powerful things about support groups. And studies have been done about support groups, oh God, since the 70s. And one of the things that was found years ago in a study on women who had breast cancer is that people, and I've heard this informally in support groups I've run and been in, that what's so incredible about it is when people come together with a common trauma, in this case, a common loss that's disenfranchised, they sometimes get more support from strangers for their loss, who just naturally understand it, than they do from people who they love and who love them, but just don't get it. And that doesn't make those people bad people, but we all need sources of support. When we have a disenfranchised loss, we need support. And sometimes we have to go outside of our inner human circle to get that. And how to navigate that is a whole other topic, but those are the issues that make animal loss different, in my experience. So
thank you for
welcome.
illustrating that so beautifully. And it's fascinating, the research you bring up about the group work and how, I personally love working with people in groups because I think we're all teachers for one another, and listening to people and witnessing other people's grief can be very profound. And in a sense, coming together in a group is a kind of a ritual. And I wanted to ask you about, rituals, because haven't been to a pet funeral myself, but, rituals are important for the human psyche. And maybe you can share with the listeners about ritual and maybe give some inspiration even of things that people can do.
Okay. Well, I could talk about this for 2 hours because I've been so blessed to be privy to things my clients have done for their animals. And I'd like to start it out, though, by saying, because this is a touchy topic for a lot of people, and that is, what do I do with their remains? What do I do with that? And this is an example of where animal communication and grief healing sort of intersect, because I'm able to speak to people's animals when they say, what do they want me to do? Let's say they're in anticipatory grief and they know their animal's going to die. They want to ask them, would you like to be cremated? Would you like to be buried? And if so, where do you want your body buried? What do you want me to do with the ashes? Very common questions. And one of the interesting things I've learned that I hope will help people listening who may be facing this now or at some point is that it's so interesting to me that so many animals, when asked about that, a specific example is, what do you want me to do with your ashes? They almost always say something to the effect of, I want you to do with my ashes what will bring meaning to you. Because I've never talked with an animal about this issue who has any attachment whatsoever to their body that's gone, especially after they've left it, but even beforehand. It's like they know they just don't have that same attachment that humans tend to have. And so often they'll say, I want you to do what's going to be helpful for you. Because to the animal on the other side, that emotional and spiritual connection still lives. It's not the least bit impacted by physical death. And so their perspective so often is, but they know that their people have an attachment, of course, to the remains of the animal, and they want them to do what's going to help them. I've heard things like, well, mommy, I think it'll help you if you sleep with them because I know you miss me sleeping with you. And I have many clients who've slept with ashes. Or they'll say, why don't you keep it with you nearby until you're ready to scatter them at such and such a place? Like some animals will say, I want to be here, I want to be there. So anyway, the rituals many of my clients have chosen are so moving. Lots of stories of gardens. I'm thinking of one client in the Los Angeles area who had a landscaper, create a big heart-shaped bed, and she put an angel statue in there, and all of her animals' ashes remains are there with little statues. Another one has a huge garden in Massachusetts, and she had these signs made with the names of her cats, and every time somebody dies, she gets a bigger sign and adds this laminated picture of the next cat with their name and the dates. It's just beautiful. Other people I know have their cats or dogs buried at pet cemeteries. I think one of the most touching ones I've been to personally was with a friend was very close to her labs, very close. And when the second one died, it was sort of for her the end of an era because they were such a big part of her life. And she happened to be a shelter manager, a local SPCA. So everybody knew her. Everybody knew these dogs because she took the dogs to work. So it was just tragic. So she had the ashes of the first one who died within a year of the second one. So it was just tragic. She made a decision, and her close friends got to go. She took the dog's ashes to the beach where they walked every day, and she made a heart with the ashes. And we were all invited to bring flowers. So we put flowers, close to the ashes. And she said some things, did some rituals that are private to honor them. We took pictures, and then we waited together as the tide came in and washed the ashes out to sea. It was so meaningful, so beautiful. And the thing about rituals that I'll say is that I don't think at all it is about what we do. I think it's the spirit behind it. And so I would encourage anybody when they're thinking of rituals for this to think of what would have meaning for them and meaning for their animal. Now, I've had memorial services for all my animals who died, and one of them had like 25 people, and we sang songs and all kinds, and I told stories, and of course had photo album after photo album for the animal for people to look through. But then with other animals, I remember one, I just knew I couldn't handle that. I didn't want it to be a group memorial. I did it with just 2 people. So it's not about the ritual itself. It's the meaning behind it. What's going to help us both honor our animal through a ritual and take care of ourselves. I think they're both equally important. And from our animals' perspective, they think what we're doing for us is even more important. But understandably, we want to memorialize them and honor them. So rituals can be very, very helpful in that way. Mm-hmm. So, does that answer your question? Rituals?
It does beautifully. Yeah, it's so true about how it's about sort of taking care of us as well. And and I know that you also talk about legacy in your work. So what do you mean by legacies?
Well, it's very interesting. When that first cat died, it just brought up everything. I mean, it was a year of very intense grieving and healing, and I was so determined to heal consciously. And I love that you call your work conscious grief. And I didn't think of it that way, but that's what I was very much trying to do. And he had a funeral. And I remember wearing what a beautiful black dress, was all dressed up, and my friends who came were all dressed up because that's just what it felt like was that I had it catered, and it just felt like it was right to do. But here's the thing, in my opinion, memorializing in any way, however we do it, can be very comforting and a big part of our healing. I encourage everybody to do something, whether it's private or with others, doesn't matter, but it can be very comforting and healing. But legacies are different. Legacy, and not better, just different. They're about the internal gifts that our animals give us that we get to keep, forever. When you hear people talk about, you're never going to be the same after grief, you'll eventually heal and may not hurt as much, but you're going to be a different person, especially if you consciously internalize everything. And to me, the goal of grief healing or grief recovery, whatever anybody wants to call it, is, of course, learning to cope with and heal the pain. That's certainly a big part of grief healing and must be part of it, versus burying it. But the other half of it, to me, is consciously using the crisis of the loss to grow. And one way we can do that, and of course, doing that's going to be different for everybody and depending on the loss, whatever. But one way we can do that is really take time to consciously look at, what are the gifts I received from this animal or person? What are the gifts that came to me? And going back to that first cat, his gift to me was unconditional love. And I had never experienced unconditional love as an adult before, certainly never from any human. Not at that point in my life. So when I processed all that, and I also I sought a therapist, and I was very blessed that first one I found loved animals. And that's very important, by the way, to anybody seeking a therapist. Don't give up on the first one. And then there's, on my blog, which is animalsoulsmatter.com, there's a whole article on how to find the best grief counselor for pet loss, things you deserve, things to ask about. So anybody listening to this, you want a therapist for your pet loss, vet them, because you could get somebody who's a great therapist who really doesn't understand anything at all about loving animals, and which I have some horror stories about that from clients. So anyway, I was very lucky because this therapist I stumbled upon really loved animals and understood it. So that helped me through it also. And one time in a session with her, like 6 months into this, she said, Teresa, you really loved Muffin, didn't you? I said, oh, of course, with all my heart. He was like my child. She said, do you believe Muffin loved you? And these were intentional questions. I said, well, of course he did. I'm thinking, why is she asking me these stupid questions? She knows the answers. I said, of course he did. He loved me more than anything, and vice versa. And then she said, stuck in this big question, she said, and do you love yourself? And if somebody asked me that today, I'm very happy to say I could say, yes, I do. I have to work on it sometimes, but I do. But this was a long time ago. And when she asked the question, I realized I don't. He loved me. I don't love myself. And she helped me with that. But what that helped me with later, when I was helping others and myself, was a very important thing, I think, for all of us to look at in loss. And that is, in this case about animals, what did my animal give me that I don't yet know how to give myself? That is one of the most powerful things we can look at to uncover the legacies. What did I receive from this being who's gone from my life now physically that they gave me that I don't know how to give myself? And when we haven't learned to do that yet, which whatever the issue might be, that's a big source of the pain. I mean, obviously we miss our loved ones physically when they go. It's excruciating. But when that issue is also there, it's quadruple excruciating, because it's not just we can't pet them. It's, my God, they gave us this huge internal gift to get through life, and they're not here to give it to me anymore. So it's that's only one kind of legacy, and that's the heaviest, dutiest one. There are ones much less provocative, but that's a biggie. I encourage anybody going through this to ask themselves that, even when their animal's alive, is to look at, what do I get from them? What are they giving me in life that hasn't been there before? And how can I receive that, not just from them, but how can I learn to give it to myself? So I think that's a crucial, crucial legacy. There are other things, that may not seem so dramatic. Thank goodness everything's not that dramatic. I hear people say things like, my dog taught me patience. My dog taught me patience, or my horse taught me courage. I have a lot of clients who are women who learn to ride at 50 or beyond, and they're scared, and then they learn they can do it. And so they'll say, my horse taught me courage. And I could go on and on, but those internal life qualities that sometimes an animal will teach us, sometimes on purpose, because that's what they came in our life for, and sometimes it just sort of unfolds that way. But and if this interests anybody, there is an article on my blog, animalsoulsmatter.com, on legacies. It's a very in-depth article that can sort of walk you through how to identify them. And the important thing about legacies isn't just identifying what they are, though that's, of course, the first step, but it's in making this commitment to, how do I make this part of my life? How do I make this part of me? Like when Muffin, that cat who died, and by the way, he came with that name. I would not name a cat Muffin. But when he died, and I realized in the middle of my grief healing that, oh my God, I realize now I never loved myself. I felt this responsibility in honor of him and myself to learn to do that. That was his legacy. It wasn't just go get another cat who might love me the same. It's, how do I do that for myself? So that's the beauty and the power of what I'm talking about with legacy. So memorializing and rituals are very powerful and important, but a legacy is very different. It's internal. And when that can become part of our life and who we are, that's fabulous. I mean, there's no better honoring someone than using the gift they gave us, or gifts that they gave us. So that's pretty powerful stuff.
It is
Yeah.
extremely powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking about, it's interesting because I've also been talking about this in my own, with my own coach recently because my little dog's not been well.
Mhm.
And, it's what it brings up inside of me and
Oh
what it's
yeah, yeah,
teaching me. And
mhm,
it's
yeah,
it's true because like this is a relationship that I'm
yep,
in,
hmm,
and it can be
hmm,
challenging for me as
yes, yeah,
well.
yeah.
So, so yeah, thank you for bringing that forward about the legacies and the gifts, and it's so important, these little souls that come into our life to teach us.
Sometimes very powerful little souls.
I know. I like to ask people because this is the Conscious Grief series, and you're already sharing so much about, transforming pain into evolution and growth. But how would you sort of interpret the idea of conscious grieving?
Well, first of all, I just want to say again, that's a great term to use. I've never heard anybody in the field use that phrase except you. And I love that phrase because and I'm going to borrow it and give you credit when I do further workshops and so forth. But I think I jotted down a few notes I'm looking at to make sure I don't forget anything. And I think it's lots of things, but two big things. One, that's finding meaning from the relationship and from the loss itself. I think many people who love their animals can cite chapter and verse without thinking about the meaning of the relationship. But to me, conscious grieving is also facing the loss itself. What can we learn from the grief? What can we learn from our pain? What can we learn about what it's like as, oh, I see your dog now. So cute. And when we're in that very, oh, look at you. Hi. Hi. Oh, everybody could just stop now and look at you. When we're in that very uncomfortable, sometimes very difficult place of anticipatory grief, even before animal might be in hospice stage, we know there's a serious illness and they aren't going to be around 5 more years. That when we can start looking at how can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? And the other one is to have an intention to grow, to really hold an intention to grow from the loss. And as I said a little earlier, I believed for many years that the goal of grief healing is twofold. One is, of course, to learn everything we can and use all the tools we can find to cope and to heal, to get through it. But the other one is what you're calling conscious grieving. That is using the crisis of the loss to grow. Because if we don't do that, we've missed a big opportunity. And every loss is different. Even people who have the same kind of animal throughout their lives, it doesn't matter. Every animal's different. Every loss is going to be different. So I think it's that holding a conscious intention to grow, and consciously being on a journey that we want to be on, taking us from brokenheartedness, which we don't have to invite that in, that's just going to be there. But this conscious intention to have not just brokenheartedness, but this intention to find peace. And unlike the stages of grief, which I heard Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talk in person many years ago, and she was quite a wonderful character. And she pounded her fist on the podium and she said, I wish the hell I never would have printed those damn stages of grief. And I knew what she was getting at because when she wrote them, and you probably know this, it was about the stages of grief dying people go through. It never was about stages of grief for people who are grieving the loss of someone. But at the time, there was so little literature in the field, clinicians glommed onto those stages. And about 2 years after she died, I was very happy to see some of the biggies in the field were finally starting to debunk the stages because it doesn't do it. The only value to stages to look at, even though they weren't even meant to be for grievers, is it can normalize. Okay, it's okay to make bargains. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel this. But anybody who grieves knows there is no linear process, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, to heal from grief. It's all over the place. and it differs for everybody. So that's another thing I would say is that this journey from brokenheartedness to finding peace is not linear and has nothing to do with stages. And to me, finding the peace means, I think of it as inviting in grace to help us. So here we are, shattered. And for anyone who has any particular spiritual beliefs or beings who they pray to, that's a good time to ask for grace, to ask for grace to come into us, around us, to help us with the anguish, the brokenheartedness. And I look at it as I went through a very, very major loss a little over a year ago. And I did this. And what I found was there were many times I felt the grace, but it wasn't like, here's the brokenheartedness. Oh, all of a sudden I invited in grace. The brokenheartedness went away and I was fine. Of course not. On any given moment, the balance of anguish, brokenheartedness, and the grace would vary. But what I find is that when people do that, when they're willing to even believe that peace and the sense of grace is possible in the midst of this journey of brokenheartedness, what it does, even if we have 5 moments of it in a given day, I'm remembering right now, it makes that razor edge sharp pain of loss softer. It doesn't make it disappear automatically, but it makes it softer. So in a given day, if the anguish is up here and grace comes in, it can kind of do this. Even if later it looks more like this, every experience we have where we invite in peace or even look for opportunities that bring peace into our life. And of course, that's all they're talking about, spiritual things that help people feel peace. But I think that's a very important part of what you call conscious grieving. And to me, grace and pain are 2 sides of the same coin. They coexist. And in most cultures, that's not, except in some spiritual literature, but psychologically, that's very often not even talked about. It's like you're in pain. Here, take some antidepressants and some drugs to help you with your grief. And some people may have value from that, but if that's the only thing somebody does, that is not conscious grieving. That's drugging yourself up so the pain doesn't hurt so much. And again, that might be necessary at some point, but that is not healing grief. That's burying grief. But inviting in grace, but still acknowledging the pain. It's like we don't need to wait for the pain to be gone before we have times of peace and grace. We don't need to wait for that. And here's a biggie to me. When we let go of resistance to our pain, it lessens it. And you know that inside and out, of course, and most clinicians know that. But in our culture, in most cultures, and again, I'm more familiar with the North American culture, but it's still a culture that by and large tells us to put some band-aids on the pain, get over it, and go on. And if you've lost an animal, you hear that even more because, again, it's a disenfranchised loss, and people are likely going to say, it's 6 months already, get another animal. Like getting another animal is going to make our grief go away. So I think that it's so important that we learn as individuals to face the pain, learn how to go through it and not keep trying to go around it. Now, at the same time, I want to say nobody, except maybe, I don't know, some guru or ascended master somewhere, which I don't think we should aspire to. I think we should aspire to being ourselves and getting through these things as humans. But I don't think anybody can sustain facing pain head on 24/7. So I just had to say that because I'm not advocating that, oh, just learn how to face your pain and buck up and deal with it. I'm not saying that at all. Again, just like when we invite in peace and grace, it might just be for moments, but that's going to stay here and help us. And also, when we're willing to face the pain directly, it lessens it. And that's the paradox a lot of people don't understand. And that's what, understandably, people want to do anything to make this pain go away. It's like, oh my God, here's all this anguish. What do I do with it? And I think that when we can offer our pain when we're feeling it and offer it the same tender, loving kindness and nurturing that we would give our animal if they're hurting. Our animal just barks funny or cries funny. What do? We rush over, are you okay? Are you okay? And we give them this wonderful nurturing and tenderness. It helps when we learn to do that for our emotional pain, to be with it, even if it's for 5 minutes, that instead of trying to push it down and forget it, to really face it so that when we accept it, it literally lessens the pain. And all of us know that on another example, when we're upset about anything, really upset, and say we talk to a friend, and the friend immediately poo-poos what we're feeling and says, oh, well, just do this and you'll forget it. What does that do to the feeling we have? It doesn't lessen it. It makes it stronger. When somebody says to us, don't feel this, or just do this and it'll go away, it makes it stronger. And so for ourselves, and no matter how much support we have around us, which I advocate everybody finding, people who really understand, the biggest support we need to nurture is ourselves. And when we can learn to be present with what we least want to be present with, whether it's during anticipatory grief or afterwards, our pain will have a shorter lifespan when we can acknowledge in that way. And just to be able to learn to surround it with love and with tenderness, I think that it just really makes a difference. And I think one other thing I would say about, I would love to talk to you for 3 hours about this, but one other thing I think is important to remember, and a gift that I received learning this from the animals, my own who died and all of my clients, and that is that love doesn't die with death. It never dies with death. What dies is the body, and we have all this grief about them not being in our physical lives anymore, but love never goes away. It's there for us to connect with. And one of the things I've heard animals say so many times to their people as I was helping them communicate is that every moment of love that an animal or a person gives us is ours to keep. And it doesn't go away at death. It's ours to keep. And it can keep growing and it can keep coming in. And same thing, our love for our animal, that is a part of them. I've heard that thousands of times that, mom, dad, whatever, every moment you loved me, you're still right here. And so I think that's another thing that may be helpful to people to know. The love never, not only does the love from the past when they were here, that doesn't die, it continues. There's no stopping of that communication of giving and sending love. And one does not need to be an animal communicator or remembering how to speak telepathically to do that. You just talk from your heart and it's there. So I think that's another thing that's especially important to remember. So,
Teresa, so many incredible pearls of wisdom. It's just wonderful listening to you speak. And, you are such an authority on this subject. And I just feel so grateful to have met you and to have had the opportunity to interview you. I really do. It's remarkable, actually. So I always like to ask people, is there anything else that you'd like to share before we complete?
no, it's interesting when I was looking through some things that talk about, well, what stories do I want to share, whatever. I found something I'd forgotten about. And it's this very short poem that a wolf recited, actually not directly to me, but to my mentor, Jerry Ryan. There was a long story, a wolf who was killed in the wild that some people had a close relationship with, even though the wolf was wild. It was a very special relationship. And Jerry and I connected to this wolf, and he said the following things. I don't think he meant it as a poem, but it sounds like one. And his name was Nahani. And he said, it is very important to incorporate loss into life. Do not fight your loss. People lose their beauty when they get stuck in loss. Move on in dignity. Take your loss with you. Remember it, revere it, and take in every bit of wisdom it brought you. Climb the ladder and scatter your loss to the winds and feel the breeze cleansing you. So, wise words from someone who was a very, very wise wolf on earth and is still very wise on the other side. So, anyway.
Thank you so much for sharing
Welcome.
that. Yeah, thank you. And just before we finish, you have a free gift for our listeners. So please.
Yes. Well, you had mentioned the Legacies work, and the phrase legacies of love has been part of my work for quite a while. And the first product, if you will, that I created about legacies is an audiobook called Legacies of Love. And the link to that will be available to anybody. I think it's about 4 hours long, and it includes a meditation to connect with your animal. So just beware, it's over 20 years old, and people say to me, I have clients call me and they say, I listened to your audiobook and this helped me, that helped me, but your voice sounds so different now. And that's because I'm old. My voice changed over time. So it is really me when you listen to it, if you do.
Amazing.
So thank you.
Well, thank you so much
for this opportunity.
Well, thank you too. And thank you to the people who've been listening or watching.
It's my pleasure. This is a tough topic, but this topic of pain and grief deserves our attention. I thank you so much for your work in bringing all these people together.
Oh, well, thank you too. And thank you.
Can we see a dog again?
Oh, yeah, see Kenny again. There.
Hi. Oh, sweetheart. Hi. Oh.
He is desperate for me to take him outside, poor thing.
Oh, what is his name?
It's Kenny Rogers.
Oh, hello, Kenny Rogers. Hi. Thank you for being part of this. I'm sure everybody out there is more interested in listening to you and seeing you than us. Right?
Yeah, he's my baby.
Very nice to see him.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you
lots of love.
Okay, you too.